Hello guys, and welcome to the Sicilian Paramour. Today we're going to be looking at the 4-pawns attack in the King's Indian defense. And while we're down that road, we might try to pick up the ideas that may have led to the birth of this variation. So it all starts when white plays d4 and black replies knight f6. Now this move is designed to stop the white pawn from coming to e4 and not allowing white to have the good pawn duo e4-d4. Now the most common reply here is c4. Now this move has a dual purpose behind it. It tries to gain more space in the center and allows the c-pawn to move before the knight comes to c3, so that the knight on c3 will now no longer block the c-pawn from coming all the way down to c4. And now black tries to get on with it with the move g6. Now as the arrows point out, this move has the purpose of fianchetting the bishop on g7, which will exert the influence on the long diagonal. After knight c3, the most common move, this move has a dual purpose again. It controls the central square e4 and allows the e-pawn to advance all the way to e4, so that the knight now can no longer capture it. So after bishop g7, we have entered the King's Indian proper. Now why do I say that? Is because in the previous move, instead of moving bishop to g7, black could have gone in for the Grunfeld with pawn to d4. Now, we're not going to discuss this. This is completely getting off topic. So, this is a pretty aggressive opening as well, and we'll come back to this later. But for now, the King's Indian. So, after bishop g7, e4, white already has 3 pawns in the center, including a knight, which already gives it a huge classical advantage. But as we're going to find out, classical advantages are always met with hypermodern ideas. So now the obvious move is d6 because it's preventing the white pawn from advancing all the way to e5 and harassing the knight. However, I must mention that in this position, the move castles can also be played, which actually provokes white to move the pawn all the way to e5, so that after knight back to e8, black will try to exert its influence on the white center with moves such as d6 and c5. A very famous game in this line would be Fischer-Letelier, which ended in a pretty spectacular queen sacrifice. So I urge you guys to go ahead and look this up. Now coming back to the main core of this video, after d6, the move f4 signifies the 4-pawns attack for pretty obvious reasons. White has 4 pawns in the center, c4, d4, e4, f4, which are already controlling all the central squares plus so many other flank squares. This just looks like complete domination all over the board. And one of the, basically white is trying to say that I'm going to put these 4 pawns and I'm going to just roll you off the board and just crack this freaky little setup by black. However, the King's Indian defense is not an easy creature to deal with, and we'll understand how such barbaric moves can do nothing against the sophisticated elegance of this defense. Alright, so all those big words aside, let's see what happens next. Black now simply castles, having full faith in his system. The most common move now for white would be knight f3, which reinforces the square e5, because that is the pawn break that white is going to play eventually. But there is another attempt, the earlier attempt of playing e5 straight away. Now, this is not a good attempt for many reasons. One of those reasons being the move knight f to d7, which exerts its influence and tries to break down the white center. Basically, in the King's Indian, what black is trying to do is he lets white build up a good center and then attacks it actively. And we must do this at all costs. Otherwise, white's extremely large center is just going to roll us over and is going to just kill us with all the space advantage. And black's pieces will be cramped with no room to maneuver. And we're just going to get, strangled to death. So Knight f to d7 attacks the pawn on e5 with the d6 pawn and the knight. So the most obvious move to sustain this center would be knight f3, but now comes the move c5, and this is already asking for too much from the white center. The water is overflowing and the dam walls cannot contain it anymore. So over here there are many options, not many, basically two options, d5 and bishop e3. Let's look at bishop e3 first. So after bishop e3, white certainly goes for c takes d4, and after bishop takes b4, d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. We're not even going to take the queen. Bishop takes e5, f takes e5, and you can already look at the state of the white center. It's nothing to be proud of, to say the least. However, after queen takes d4, white suffers an even gruesome fate. After knight c6, and let's say the queen moves to the most natural square, queen d2, d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight from c takes e5, or the other way, doesn't matter, f takes e5, and already the white center looks, well, it's not a center anymore, and knight takes e5, and basically white is even a pawn down in this position, and the center is nothing, just a lowly pawn on c4. Everything has disappeared, and it's a superior position for black. Another reply after c5 would be the reply d5, and now we're actually entering a pawn sacrifice, because the pawn on e5 is now attacked more than it's defended. So we can just go ahead and d takes e5, and you know, there are many moves that white has played here. You can check that out in the database. However, one of my own over the board games went queen c2, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and knight b6. You can already see the white center is not quite a center. I mean, it's c4 and d5 pawns, and the pawn break, or you can say, you know, just chipping away at the center with e6 is coming up very soon. I managed to win this game in, as I remember, pretty spectacular fashion, but that's a story for some other day. So now we know why in this position e5 kinda doesn't work. So how about we prepare it with knight f3? This is the most common move and the move recommended by theory. There are many moves that can be played here. Some of them include c5, moves like bishop g4. However, I'm going to concentrate at a move which is kind of slightly underrated by theory. However, it has a very practical approach, and that is just to get on with it with e5. And this is just like a jab in the center. I mean, this square is protected so many times, and yet black just thirsts a pawn in here. And everything has a good strategic and tactical basis for this. Indeed, white wants, if he wants to, he can win a pawn in this variation. But we'll see that the f8 rook makes up for everything. Now, this line is actually recommended in Dejan Boykov's book, The Modernized King's Indian, by Metropolitan Chess Publishing. And it is a fantastic book, and you should have a look at it if you really feel interested. You'll also get more ideas about the knight to a6 lines. So let's look into it. So in this very position, I have actually compiled 5 possible replies by white. So we're going to look all of them at sequential order, from going from the worst to the best replies. So without further ado, let's get into it. The reply f4 seems to be the most easily refuted with e takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes e4. Now this is attacking the queen and by the bishop, and also just takes away the pawn. And don't even think about taking the knight with the queen, because after rook e8, you can kiss her goodbye. Another reply here could be bishop e3. But now comes a spectacular move, knight takes e4 here. And this move actually solves all the problems for black. Say knight takes e4, e takes f4. Now this move frees up the e-file for the rook, where the white king is just laying there helplessly. But this does so with a gain of tempo, because the bishop on e3 is now hit by the pawn. So say after bishop takes f4, rook e8, there's no way you can save that knight. Best try could be bishop d3. This doesn't save you after f5. Say bishop g5 is the only way to complicate matters, but how long can you complicate when you're just gonna be down? Bishop f6, bishop takes, queen takes, castle, f takes e4, and basically this is it. You can't even take the pawn because of the rook. Alright, although I must mention that after bishop e3, black does have another alternative variation with e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and knight takes e4, with the same ideas that after knight takes, rook e8 is going to win the piece with a superior position. So the third response we can enter after the move e5 is the move d5. But it doesn't work because we can always chip away at one of the pawns, which is f4. So e takes f4, bishop takes f4 is forced, and now you see the beautiful harmony in the white center and the three white pieces, which are so naturally developed. However, you're going to see what happens just after a second, and all of this could actually be a sandcastle, not a fortress. The move knight takes e4 just rips apart everything, with the same idea cropping up again and again and again, which is knight takes e4 and rook e8. As always, however, I would like to introduce a good line over here. Bishop d3, f5, bishop g5. As I told you, the only way to complicate matters, but it doesn't. Bishop f6, bishop takes, queen takes, castle, f takes, and now white can play his own cards, or at least try to, with the move rook e1. And now this is setting up a counterpin. So e takes d3 is not possible because our rook hangs. And although black is already a pawn up in this variation, and the white center looks not much like a center, we have this slow, steady dagger push, the move e3. Although I must mention that the other move, bishop f5 in this position, is also pretty good. However, e3 just makes that much more zen to this. And the white center is just the two pawns on c4 and d5. Nothing to worry about. And we have an extra pawn, which is all the way down to e4. I'm sorry, e3. So you can already see the kind of prospects that black is getting in this system. However, we're not done yet. And now we enter one of the most challenging moves for this system, which is f takes e4. Now, this is one of the main lines, the other one being the d takes e5, which we're going to look at in the last. So how to deal with this? Well, the obvious move, d takes e5, does the job. Now over here, there are two most common moves, one of them being d5 and the other one being knight takes e5. Let's look at d5 first. So after d5, now you can see that white has its good center, and believe me, this is a good center. So black must do everything he can to destroy it, otherwise the whole concept of King's Indian would be flawed. This is done with the move c6. Now the c6, much like the move f6 in some other variations, aims to chip away at the white center. Now best play goes here, bishop g5, knight from b to d7, and basically you can play many moves here. Let's say a sample line runs like bishop e2, queen b6, attacking the pawn, which the bishop no longer defends, b3, say, and now we can have just c takes d5, c takes d5, and the two pawns over here are the only thing that is left of the center, and these are hanging pawns, by the way. Now we can just go ahead with the move h6, trying to deflect the bishop somewhere. Now just note, it cannot go back to e3 because the queen is there. So h4 seems the most obvious, and now knight c5. It's double attacking the pawn on e4, and there are two replies that you can do here. Trying to protect it with a piece like queen c2 doesn't work, because now we have the spectacular knight from c takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, and now bishop f5. Although the queen is running short of squares, it's not yet trapped, and the idea is not to trap the queen, it is to win material and with interest. So after queen c4, queen a4 is objectively the best, but both of them are met by the move e4, which attacks the knight on f3 and also the rook. And white is going to lose material here. Another move to deal with the pressure could be bishop takes f6. But after bishop takes f6, let's say the move queen c2, bishop g4, queenside castle, and rook from a to c8. We already have a lot of trump cards here. The rook on c8 is having a pretty evil presence or malignant presence in the on the c file, and we have the two bishop advantage. So this is more than enough to play for as black, and the computer evaluation will justify the same. So after f takes, e takes, we have looked at the move d5. So now is the time to look at the main line, knight takes e5. Now the problem with this move is that the knight on e5 is actually quite shaky because it's protected by the d4 pawn. So the most obvious move here would be c5, and just trying to break it up. And after that we have a digression again. We have two moves. Either we can play d5 and go in for this rook e8 business, after which you'll have to retreat your knight back, and we're just gonna take up the pawn. A sample run can run like knight takes e4, f5. Now, we know this trick all too well now, don't we? Bishop e2, f takes, knight d2, and now bishop d4. This is actually a bone cruncher for white, because the white king cannot castle anymore because of the bishop, and best play might run with knight to b3 with many variations, and I urge you to check them out, but this is nonetheless a more than comfortable position for black. However, after the move c5, d5, after rook e8 there can be another move, just trying to protect the knight maybe on e5 using the bishop, but this doesn't work out because of knight takes e4, which double attacks, and well, you're just gonna lose a piece no matter what. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, and even the knight is pinned. Bishop d3 doesn't do the job because of f5. So basically, this is a pretty lost position for white yet again. Another variation after c5 can be bishop e3, but over here the play is very simple, and we go c takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes e4 yet again, knight takes e4, and now rook e8. And we're gonna win one of the knights for sure. And also, I would like to bring to your attention the word center, which white doesn't know anything of. Alright, so this move, 6e5, is packing quite a bit of punch. But wait till you hear about it in the real main line, which comes after the move d takes e5. And now we have the obvious move d takes e5, and now there is a digression. There's a minor variation in which you can go f takes e5, which attacks the knight, and we now swap queens first. White is forced to take with the king, because if he takes with the knight, with the black knight on f6 can always gobble up the pawn, which is only defended by the knight on c3. Don't whistle at me. Alright, so after king takes d1, knight g4 is the move, because it's attacking the pawn on e5 twice. But if white foolishly plays bishop f4, he's not understanding that the move knight g4 is doing much more than just attacking. It's actually doing this. Knight f2 check, which is pretty painful to say the least. Alright, so taking f takes e5 aside, the other main line is the real main line, that is queen takes d8, swapping off, and after the obvious move, rook takes, knight takes e5. And I cannot tell you how many times I've encountered this move, not in any over-the-board games, but in blitz and in online play, so many times. And it just seems like a good position for white, but in fact it isn't. Now there are two good moves here, one of them being rook e8, which is developing pressure on the e file. However, the move I'm going to recommend here is knight f to d7, which is putting a question to the knight on e5. And if allowed, black is just gonna take twice, and it's gonna be very damaged pawn structure. So the obvious move here would be knight takes d7. After this, we must play this in-between move, bishop takes c3 check first, which damages the pawn structure further. So after b takes c3, knight takes d7. Yes, white has the 2 bishop advantage, but the pawns on the c file, the c3 and the c4 pawns, are nothing to be proud of. So after the move bishop e3, this is a pretty good move because the knight was threatening to go to c5 and harass the pawn on e4 when bishop d3 cannot be played because of the rook on d file. So knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4. The only move to protect the pawn would be e5, and after knight e4, the knight is already posted on a pretty beautiful square and is attacking the pawn on c3. And the only way to defend this is rook to c1, but after f6, black starts his mining operations yet again and undermining the center. Well, you can obviously always take e takes f6 and knight takes f6, but of course your pawn structure, or shall I say your center, is non-existent. Alright, but after, let's say, the move bishop e2, we're gonna take, you're gonna take, and we just play rook e8. The yellow highlights the pathetic position of the center, and don't even think about protecting it with a move like bishop d4, because c5, you have to move the bishop, cannot take the pawn because of the knight, or maybe protecting the pawn the other way, f4 doesn't work because of g5. And if you really insist on keeping the bishop on that diagonal, it's not gonna last too long. Bishop g3, knight takes g3, h takes g3, and yes, look at your pawn structure, and it is something you cannot take a selfie with. Let's just leave it there. Not to mention the pawn on e5 is more lost than Kate Winslet's necklace in the Titanic. Okay, not digressing too further, let's go back and look at some variation that we might have missed. After the move knight fd7, white can actually try bishop e3, but it doesn't help its cause much because after knight takes e5, f takes e5, bishop takes, the center is not a center, and this is a pretty comfortable position for black to play. Another move here could be the move knight d5, which is actually threatening the c7 pawn. So many people would play a6 here, but I would in fact recommend you to go straight up and take knight takes e5. If f takes e5, you can just go knight a6, but the real challenge comes after knight takes c7, knight from e to c6, knight takes a8, and knight a6. We are planning to remove all the pieces in between the rook and the knight and just capture it. Best play can go like bishop e3, or more I should say the sample line, bishop e6, rook d1, and rook takes a8. We have 2 knights for the rook and pretty good compensation, and it is a good game. It's a very unbalanced and a lively game, and that's what we expect when we play the King's Indian, don't we? The very last variation that we're gonna check out is after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and instead of knight takes, we can have f takes e5. And the standard treatment here would be knight from f to d7, attacking the pawn twice, is going to be lost. If you try to protect it, sorry, lost again. And with this, the center is no longer a center. I don't know how many times should I say this, because it actually is the case. And the 4 pawns attack, which was born out of the determination to keep the center alive and just roll black off, the center does not remain, because black always finds enough counterplay and enough resources to just chip away at this magnificent center that white possesses at the starting of the game. So I hope this gives you enough confidence to go after the move knight f3 with e5, and I hope you get good results with this move, because it is a really interesting move and you should always check this out. Alright, so without taking much further time. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more, because we'll be having a lot of more interesting discussions on this attack, so to speak, in the further videos. So thanks for watching and see you next time.